The silence in the grand archive of the hegemony was a physical thing, a weight composed of dust motes and the patient exhalations of decaying paper. Elian moved through it not as an intruder but as a component of its delicate ecosystem. His hands, clad in thin polymer gloves, traced the spines of data slate casings, the cool, unyielding surfaces of familiar comfort. Here history was tamed, catalogued, and stripped of its chaotic passions. It was ordered into submission, just like everything else, just like him. His designation was Beta, a solid, unremarkable, wonderfully stable classification that had been the bedrock of his existence for all of his 26 years. It meant he was a functionary, a cog in the magnificent, sterile machine of the state. He was not swayed by the pheromonal tempests of alphas or the devastating cyclical needs of omegas. He was temperate, logical, and blessedly beautifully neutral. His world was one of quiet corridors, the soft hum of climate control, and the crisp, dry scent of antiquity. It was a world he had meticulously curated and fiercely protected. He was an archivist, a keeper of ghosts. His work was a communion with the dead and the forgotten, a process of translating the messy, vibrant past into clean, accessible data streams for the directorate. He preferred the physical artifacts, the pre-hegemony relics that still held the ghost of a human touch. A leather-bound book with its pages softened by 1,000 turns, a faded photograph of faces creased with alien emotions, a handwritten letter where the ink had bled with what could have been tears or rain. These were his secrets, his small rebellions. To feel the texture of a bygone world was a pleasure so subtle, so profoundly personal, it felt like a sin in a society that had legislated against unnecessary sensation. The directorate preached efficiency over emotion, data over sentiment. Elian agreed in principle, but in the deep quiet of the lower vaults, surrounded by the ghosts of a less perfect era, he allowed himself this small, harmless indulgence. He was a steward of memory, and sometimes he let the memories breathe on him. Today the air felt different, thicker. A strange humidity seemed to cling to the back of his throat, a cloying warmth that had nothing to do with the archive's precisely regulated temperature. He attributed it to a minor system fluctuation, a transient error in the atmospheric processors. He logged a maintenance request on his datapad, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. The action was calming, a small reassertion of order over a minor anomaly. He ran a diagnostic on the environmental controls for Vault Gamma 7, where the oldest texts were stored. All systems reported green, nominal, perfect. Yet the feeling persisted. A low, thrumming hum vibrated just beneath his skin, a frequency he had never felt before. It was distracting. He pushed it down, focusing on the task at hand, authenticating a series of pre-unification charters. The script was archaic, the language a tapestry of forgotten dialects. It required absolute concentration, a deep dive into the linguistic architecture of a dead culture. It was the kind of challenge he savored, a puzzle of pure logic. But his focus kept slipping. The elegant curves of the script seemed to blur at the edges, the scent of the aged paper turning acrid and sharp in his nostrils, almost metallic. A faint sheen of sweat slicked his brow. Unacceptable. Betas did not suffer from such crude biological betrayals. Their bodies were models of efficiency, predictable and temperate. He paused, pressing the cool back of his gloved hand to his forehead. His skin was hot, unnaturally so. A fever, perhaps. The thought was irritating. Sickness was an inefficiency, a disruption to his schedule. He would need to report to the medical ward after his shift, submit to the indignity of a diagnostic scan, and likely be prescribed a nutrient paste and a mandated rest period. The very idea set his teeth on edge. The archive was his sanctuary, and the thought of being barred from it, even for a day, felt like a kind of exile. He resolved to ignore it, to push through the discomfort with the same disciplined resolve he applied to all things. He was a beta. He was in control. He took a slow, measured breath, intending to reset his equilibrium, but the air he drew in was heavy, syrupy, and charged with a scent he couldn't identify. It wasn't the familiar, comforting smell of paper and dust. It was something else, something organic, sweet, and deeply unsettling. It smelled like blooming nightshade, like honey and ozone. It smelled like it was coming from him. A wave of dizziness washed over him, so profound he had to grip the edge of the console to keep from swaying. The lumens overhead seemed to pulse, their steady, sterile light fracturing into painful shards. The hum beneath his skin intensified, graduating from a subtle vibration to a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to originate in the base of his spine. It was a feeling of activation, a system coming online that he never knew he possessed. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of heat and confusion. This was not a simple fever. This was a catastrophic system failure. His body, his reliable, predictable beta body, was lying to him. It was engaged in a profound and terrifying act of treason against the self he had so carefully constructed. He stumbled back from the console, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He had to get out. He had to get to the sterile anonymity of a sanitation chamber, somewhere he could contain this event. Before anyone noticed, before anyone could see his meticulously ordered world shatter into a million incoherent pieces. He was halfway to the vault door when it slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss, revealing a figure that made the blood freeze in his veins. Commander Valerius, the Alpha of Alphas, head of the Directorate's Internal Security, a man whose name was a synonym for cold, unassailable authority. He stood silhouetted against the corridor's harsh lighting, a monolith of power and control, his presence sucking all the air from the room. And his eyes, the color of a winter storm, landed directly on Elian. The onset was insidious, a traitorous whisper in the blood. It began as a warmth, a pleasant, languid heat pooling low in his belly, something he initially mistook for the lingering effect of the midday nutrient ration. Elian, a creature of habit and precision, noted the sensation and dismissed it. His body was a closed system, its functions as predictable as the archival access codes he memorized each morning. There was no room for deviation, yet the warmth did not fade. It grew, spreading like a dye through water, a slow, inexorable bloom that crept up his spine and settled at the base of his skull. It was a fever, he told himself again, a simple biological malfunction. He increased the flow of chilled air to his workstation, the soft hiss of the vent a comforting sound of order. But the cold air only seemed to make the heat within him burn brighter, a furnace stoked by an invisible hand. Then came the sense, the archive, his sanctuary of muted, comforting smells, the dry vanilla of aging paper, the faint ozone of the data servers, the sterile cleanness of the filtered air began to warp. The familiar scents became distorted, amplified into a nauseating cacophony. The paper smelled like sugar on the verge of burning. The servers hummed with the metallic tang of blood. The clean air was thin and sharp, scratching at the back of his throat. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he were a passenger in his own body. His hands, usually so steady as they navigated the delicate interfaces of the artifacts, trembled. A fine tremor ran through him, a seismic precursor to a quake he could not comprehend. He tried to focus on the text on the screen before him, a dry treatise on hegemony trade policy from the last century, but the words swam, refusing to resolve into meaning. His own scent, the one he had carried his whole life, a faint, clean smell like fresh linen and cool stone, the neutral, unobtrusive scent of a beta, was changing. It was thickening, sweetening, becoming something complex and alarming. Panic, a cold, slick serpent, began to coil in his gut. This was wrong. This was a violation of the fundamental laws of his own biology. He had been tested, screened, certified. Designation Beta. The certificate was filed away in his personal records, a black and white guarantee of a stable, moderate life. A life free from the biological tyranny that governed alphas and omegas. A life of service, quiet dignity, and control. He clung to that certainty like a drowning man to a spar. It was a fever, a neurological anomaly, a temporary environmental toxin. It could be anything but the one thing it felt like. He pushed back from his console, the legs of his chair scraping against the polished floor with a sound that was unnervously loud in the oppressive silence. He needed to get to the medical bay. He needed to be contained, diagnosed, and fixed. The thought of anyone witnessing this unraveling was more terrifying than the symptoms themselves. To be seen as aberrant, as unstable, was a social death sentence. He stood and a wave of vertigo sent the room tilting. The rows upon rows of silent shelves seemed to lean in, whispering. His own heartbeat was a frantic drum against his ribs, a wild, terrified bird trapped in a cage of bone. The sweet, cloying scent intensified, blooming from his skin in waves. It was the smell of fear, of confusion, and of something else. Something deeper. A calling, a signal, a desperate primal broadcast he was sending out against his will. He took a staggering step towards the exit, his body feeling both heavy and disconnected, a poorly piloted machine. And that is when the vault door slid open. The figure standing there was an embodiment of everything Elian was not. Commander Valerius was the apex of the Alpha hierarchy, a man carved from granite and ice. His uniform was immaculate, his posture a study in rigid control. His scent, a clean, sharp fragrance of winter air and cold steel, cut through the thick, sweet haze Elian was producing, a shock of Arctic clarity in a sweltering jungle. Valerius had not come for him. His presence in the deep archives was an anomaly in itself. A man of his rank did not personally retrieve data files. Yet here he was. His gaze, famously dispassionate, swept the room and then settled on Elian. For a flicker of a second, the commander's glacial composure seemed to crack. His nostrils flared, an almost imperceptible movement. But in the supercharged atmosphere of the vault, it was as loud as a scream. He took a step inside, and the door hissed shut behind him, sealing them in together. The air vibrated with a sudden, unbearable tension. Valerius's eyes, a piercing gray, narrowed. He was processing, analyzing, his mind working with the cold precision he was known for. He was assessing a threat. And the threat, Elian realized with a surge of pure, unadulterated terror, was him. Archivist? Valerius's voice was a low baritone, calm and lethally steady, but there was a new roughness to it, a gravelly undertone that hadn't been there before. Report your status. Elian opened his mouth to answer, to formulate a lie, to say it was a fever, a system malfunction, anything. But the only thing that came out was a choked gasp. The commander took another step closer. His scent intensified, a deliberate act of dominance, a wave of cold power designed to pacify, to control. But it did not pacify Elian. Instead, it struck the raging furnace inside him like a bellows, and the fire roared. A crippling wave of heat washed through him, buckling his knees. He fell not with a crash, but with a slow, boneless slide to the floor. The last thing he saw before his vision dissolved into a gray haze was the commander's polished black boots, taking a swift, decisive step towards him. The last thing he smelled was the clean scent of winter steel, being consumed by a rising tide of honey and night-blooming flowers. The lie he had lived his entire life had just burned away, leaving him naked and terrified in its ashes. The world returned in fractured shards of sensation. the sting of antiseptic in his nostrils, a smell so clean it was painful, the unyielding cold of a polished chrome surface against his cheek, the low, monotonous beep of a medical monitor, each pulse a nail hammering home the reality of his situation. Elian was no longer in the archive. He was property now, a biological event reclassified as a security risk. He pried his eyelids open, the light of the medical bay a sterile, unforgiving white that made him flinch. He was on a transport gurney, his wrists and ankles secured by soft but firm restraints. The polymer gloves were gone, his hands bare. He felt naked, exposed, his own skin a source of profound betrayal. Two figures in sterile white uniforms stood over him, their faces obscured by reflective visors. They moved with an impersonal efficiency, their gloved hands attaching sensors to his temples, drawing a vial of blood from his arm. He was not a person to them. He was data, a problem to be quantified. Subject's pheromone output is stabilizing but remains at anomalous level A, one of them said, his voice tinny and filtered through his helmet's comm system. Core temperature is down 3 degrees but still elevated. Designation unconfirmed. The word hung in the air, a death sentence for the life he had known. Unconfirmed. He was a blank space, a question mark in a system that abhorred ambiguity. He remembered the vault, the cloying sweetness of his own scent, the fall, and Commander Valerius. The memory sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him, a terror so profound it momentarily cleared the hazy fog from his mind. He had been discovered by the one man whose attention was a precursor to erasure or assimilation. The commander did not tolerate anomalies. He corrected them. From the observation deck overlooking the sterile processing room, Valerius watched the scene unfold. His face was a mask of cold neutrality, his posture as rigid and unyielding as the reinforced glass that separated him from the subject on the gurney. But inside, a war was being waged. The scent from the archive still clung to him, a phantom presence that had burrowed its way past his formidable control. It was a scent unlike any he had ever encountered. Omegas, in the rare instances he had been exposed to them, smelled of simple things, of springtime, of milk, of warmth. They were scents designed to be pleasing, to soothe. This scent was different. It was complex, intoxicating, and laced with a sharp, intelligent edge of something that smelled like ozone and old paper. It was a scent that didn't just appeal to his primal instincts. It engaged his mind. It was the scent of the archivist, of Elian. He had felt the moment the archivist's biology had shattered. One moment there was the faint, clean scent of a beta, and the next a tidal wave of pheromones had slammed into him, a force so potent it had momentarily staggered him. It was the scent of a first heat, raw, unfiltered, and cataclysmically powerful. An instinct he hadn't felt since his brutal alpha training in the academy, an instinct he had suppressed and mastered decades ago, had roared to life in the back of his skull. Protect. Claim. Mine. The thoughts were primitive, unacceptable, a corruption of his disciplined mind. He had crushed them with practiced ease, but their echo remained. He had done his duty. He had secured the area, sedated the subject, and transferred him to the Biological Containment Division, all with his trademark ruthless efficiency. His report was a model of clinical detachment. Subject 734, it began, stripping Elian of his name and reducing him to a number. Male, age 26, previously designated beta. Exhibited spontaneous Omega presentation event at 14:32 hours. Subject is now secure and undergoing assessment. He had followed protocol to the letter, and yet he had not returned to his duties at the Security Directorate. He was here, standing in the cold silence of the observation deck, watching them treat the archivist like a lab specimen. He told himself it was his duty to oversee the situation. the archivist had presented in his presence, the security implications were his responsibility. It was a logical, defensible reason. It was also a lie. He was here because he could not leave. The scent, the archivist's wide, terrified eyes, the primal roar in his own blood, it had created a connection, a tether he could not see but could feel, pulling taut between this sterile room and the iron fortress of his self-control. "Commander," a voice said from behind him. It was Dr. Aris, the head of the containment division, a man whose face was perpetually pinched with a mixture of scientific curiosity and bureaucratic weariness. An extraordinary case. We've reviewed his biorecords. Every test, from childhood onward, marked him as a baseline beta. No hormonal markers, no genetic precursors. He shouldn't exist. Valerius did not turn. He kept his eyes fixed on the gurney below. Elian, Subject 734, was struggling weakly against his restraints, a silent, desperate panic in his eyes. "What is his status?" Valerius asked, his voice flat. "The initial heat is overwhelming his system. It's a miracle it didn't kill him outright. The late onset means his body has no idea how to regulate it. We're administering suppressants, but his biology is fighting them. It's aggressive." Valerius felt a flicker of something dark and possessive at the doctor's words. Aggressive. He had felt it. The archivist's scent wasn't just a plea, it was a challenge, a declaration, and his designation? Omega, unquestionably, one of the most potent I've ever recorded. Aris paused. "Commander, his pheromones have a unique binding affinity, specifically for your alpha profile. The initial contact in the vault seems to have imprinted. He has marked you as a compatible high-dominance alpha. It's why his system is reacting so violently. It's calling for you." The doctor's words were clinical, a scientific observation, but to Valerius they landed like a physical blow. Imprinted. The archivist's biology had reached out and latched onto his without consent, without permission. It was a violation, a weakness, and yet the primal, savage part of him that he kept chained in the deepest dungeon of his mind stirred, and it whispered a single triumphant word: good. The room was a white cube, white walls, white floor, white ceiling. The only color was the dull gray of the simple tunic he wore and the silver of the monitoring cuff locked around his wrist. There was no window, only a panel of mirrored glass that stretched the length of one wall. Elian knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he was being watched. He sat on the edge of the narrow cot, the only furniture in the sterile space, and tried to piece together the fractured mosaic of his identity. He was Elian, an archivist. He loved the smell of old books and the quiet solitude of the vaults. He was methodical, calm, and rational. He was a beta. That last thought was a lie now, a ghost of a life that had been stolen from him. The evidence was his own body, which had become a foreign and hostile landscape. The heat was a constant, a low-grade fever that never broke, punctuated by violent waves that left him slick with sweat and trembling. His senses were raw, abraded. The filtered air tasted of chemicals, the texture of the gray tunic was coarse against his hypersensitive skin, and the silence of the room was a roaring emptiness. He was an Omega. The word felt alien in his mind, a label for someone else. Omegas in the hegemony were rare jewels, protected and controlled, their lives governed by their biology. They were beautiful, fragile creatures bred for compatibility and paired with powerful alphas to produce strong offspring. They were assets. He was not an asset. He was not a fragile creature. He was a mistake, a biological error that the system would now have to correct. He wrapped his arms around himself, a futile gesture of comfort. His mind kept replaying his past, searching for a clue, a sign he had missed. He remembered the designation test as a child. He was 7. He sat on a cold table in a room much like this one, while a medic applied a cold gel to his wrist and neck. The machine hummed and a series of lights blinked. He remembered the look of profound, soul-deep relief on his parents' faces when the medic had read the results. Designation: Beta, baseline, normal. His father had lifted him up, his hands strong and steady. "Good B," he had said, his voice thick with emotion. "A good, solid life for you, son. No trouble." No trouble. The words were a bitter irony now. His entire existence had become trouble. Behind the one-way mirror, Valerius stood his silent vigil. He had not left the observation post for 18 hours. He had his meals sent in, he reviewed security reports on a datapad, but his primary focus remained fixed on the white room and the man inside it. He watched Elian tremble, watched him curl into himself, a portrait of quiet despair. He watched and he felt the unwelcome stir of an emotion he had long since excised from his operational matrix: empathy. He was a commander. He dealt in strategy, in threats, in outcomes. The emotional state of a biological anomaly was irrelevant data, and yet he could not look away. He saw the archivist's hands, the long, clever fingers that had once handled delicate artifacts, now clenched into white-knuckled fists. He saw the disciplined posture, the attempt to maintain composure, even as his own body was tearing him apart. He did not see a hysterical Omega. He saw a man of order trapped in a storm of chaos. A man like himself. The doctor's words echoed in his mind, imprinted. "It's calling for you." It was true. He could feel it across the sterile distance, through the reinforced glass. A low, insistent hum at the edge of his senses, a pull. The archivist's scent, though contained by the room's filtration system, was a ghost in the air, a scent his own alpha biology recognized with an alarming proprietary certainty. It was a flaw in his design, this reaction, a vulnerability. For his entire career, he had been the perfect instrument of the hegemony, cold, efficient, and utterly in control. His alpha nature was a tool, a weapon to be deployed for intimidation and command, not a weakness to be exploited by a random biological event. The disgust he felt was directed as much at himself as it was at the situation. He was compromised. He requested the archivist's full file again, this time using his highest security clearance. He bypassed the standard medical records and went deeper into the raw data of the initial designation test. He ran the diagnostic himself, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. And then he saw it, a flicker. An anomaly in the original data stream, so small it would have been missed by anything but the most rigorous analysis. A marker, a recessive Omega gene, flagged and then erased. A manual override, time-stamped and authenticated with a high-level administrative code from 20 years ago. It wasn't an error, it was a cover-up. Someone had deliberately hidden what Elian was. Someone had sentenced him to a life built on a lie, knowing that one day the dam would break. The question was why? Why hide a potential Omega, a valuable asset to the state? It made no sense. Unless the Omega himself was not the goal. Unless he was meant to be something else. A weapon? A trigger? For whom? The question settled like a shard of ice in Valerius's gut. His problem had just become infinitely more complex. This wasn't just a biological anomaly. It was a conspiracy. And the quiet, terrified archivist in the White Room was at the center of it. The crisis point arrived without warning. One moment, Elian was tracing the seams on the thin mattress with a numb finger, and the next, a cataclysmic wave of heat slammed into him, an order of magnitude greater than anything he had experienced before. It was not a wave, it was a tsunami, a firestorm. His vision bleached to white, and a sound like tearing metal ripped through his ears. His back arched, a violent, involuntary spasm that threw him from the cot onto the cold floor. His body was no longer his. It was a vessel for a primal, agonizing force that was trying to burn its way out. Pain, white-hot and absolute, lanced through every nerve. It felt like his bones were dissolving, his blood turning to lava. He was dying. He was being remade. He was screaming, but he couldn't hear it over the roar in his own head. In the observation room, the monitors blared. A flatline alarm for Elian's neural activity was followed by a spike so high it pushed the sensors into the red. "He's seizing," Dr. Aris yelled into his comm. "The suppressants have failed. His system is in full-blown pheromonal cascade." Two medics in heavy biocontainment suits burst into the white room, but they were thrown back as if by a physical force. The air itself had become a weapon, saturated with a concentration of pheromones so potent it overwhelmed their suit filters, triggering an immediate alpha threat response. They staggered back, choking, their own instincts turning on them. "We can't get to him," one of them gasped, falling to his knees. "The air is toxic." Valerius watched, his entire body rigid. He saw Elian on the floor, convulsing, his body a taut bow of agony. He saw the medics neutralized. He saw the frantic, useless activity in the control room. Protocol was failing. The system was failing, and the archivist was dying. The primal instinct he had been fighting, the one that whispered mine, was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, a command that shook the foundations of his discipline. Protect. Before he was even aware of making a conscious decision, he was moving. He slapped the emergency override panel, unlocking the door to the containment chamber. "Commander, no," Aris shouted. "You can't go in there, your alpha profile. The reaction will be exponential." Valerius ignored him. He stripped off his formal uniform jacket, tossing it aside as he strode through the airlock. He didn't need a containment suit. He was the storm's destination. The moment he stepped into the room, the air hit him. It was like walking into a furnace, a physical wall of heat and scent. The sweet, intoxicating aroma of honey and ozone was no longer a subtle call. It was a shriek, a desperate, agonizing plea, aimed directly at him. His own instincts surged, a wave of possessive, dominant energy rising to meet the challenge. The air crackled around him, but beneath the raw power of the scent, there was pain. So much pain. Elian, in his delirious agony, felt the shift in the atmosphere. Through the storm of his senses, a new scent cut through the chaos. Winter steel, cold, clean authority. It was the commander. A part of his mind screamed in terror, but his body, his traitorous, instinctual body, reacted with something else. A desperate, shuddering relief. It was the anchor he had been searching for in the hurricane. Valerius crossed the room in 3 long strides. He knelt beside Elian's thrashing form, his movements economical and precise. He had to ground him. He had to stop the seizure before the man's heart gave out. Protocol dictated sedation. Instinct dictated something else entirely. He placed his hands on Elian's shoulders, a firm, heavy pressure meant to pin him, to hold him against the storm. The moment his skin made contact with the thin fabric of Elian's tunic, a jolt, powerful and electric, shot through both of them. It was not sexual. It was something deeper, more fundamental, a circuit completing, a lock finding its key. Elian's convulsions intensified for a moment, and then miraculously they began to subside. The violent thrashing lessened into a deep, shuddering tremor. A choked sob escaped his lips, the first coherent sound he had made. Valerius leaned closer, his voice a low, commanding rumble that vibrated through the very floor. "Archivist, Elian, cease. You are safe." He did not know why he used the man's name. It was a breach of protocol, an act of intimacy in a clinical crisis. But it felt right, necessary. Elian's eyes, dilated and unfocused, fluttered open. He couldn't see the commander's face, only a dark shape, a presence. But he could smell him. He could feel the solid, grounding weight of his hands. The scent of winter steel was a shield against the fire consuming him. The pain was still there, but it was no longer an all-consuming void. It now had a boundary, a limit. His body, responding to the proximity of the dominant compatible alpha it had been screaming for, began to regulate. His breathing, which had been a series of ragged gasps, deepened. The frantic hammering of his heart slowed to a powerful, thudding rhythm that seemed to fall into sync with the commander's. Valerius did not move. He held the archivist, his hands firm on his shoulders, until the last of the tremors faded, leaving Elian limp and exhausted on the floor. He was slick with sweat, his face pale, but he was breathing. He was alive. In the silence that followed, Valerius became aware of the figure standing dumbfounded in the doorway, of the frantic chatter on the comms going silent. He had broken every rule. He had bypassed security, ignored medical advice, and initiated physical contact with an unstable biological subject. He had revealed a connection, a vulnerability for all to see. He looked down at the man beneath his hands, at the dark hair plastered to his forehead, at the fragile pulse beating in his neck, and he felt no regret, only a cold, terrifying certainty. This was not a problem he could delegate. This was not a security risk he could contain. This was his. Lucidity returned slowly, like a cautious tide creeping over a desolate beach. Elian was aware of the softness of a mattress beneath him, the clean, crisp feel of sheets against his skin. The roaring fire in his blood had subsided to embers, a dull, aching heat that was manageable, almost peaceful. The silence in the room was different now. It was not empty, but full, resonant with the echo of the storm that had just passed. He remembered the pain, the feeling of being torn apart from the inside out. He remembered the floor, cold and unyielding. And he remembered a presence, a voice, hands. The memory was hazy, dreamlike, but the sensory data was undeniable. The scent of winter steel and cold authority, the grounding weight of a firm touch on his shoulders, the low, rumbling command that had pierced through his agony and pulled him back from the brink. Commander Valerius. He had been there. He had touched him. Elian's eyes snapped open. The shame was a physical blow so intense it made him gasp. To be seen in such a state, so completely undone, so primal. By anyone, it would have been a humiliation. By Commander Valerius, the very embodiment of control and power, it was a violation of his deepest sense of self. He was a creature of order, and he had been reduced to pure chaotic instinct at the commander's feet. But beneath the shame, a more insidious and confusing emotion coiled, an echo of the relief he had felt, the terrifying, undeniable sense of safety that the commander's presence had brought him. His biology had yearned for that dominant presence, had recognized it as its counterpart, its solution. His mind, his carefully constructed identity as a rational beta, was revolted. This conflict was a new kind of torture, quieter than the heat, but no less devastating. In his office, a stark, minimalist space of gray chrome and black leather, Valerius reviewed the recording of the incident. He watched himself on the screen, a cold, impassive figure striding into the heart of a pheromonal storm. He watched himself kneel, touch the archivist, speak his name. He analyzed his own actions with the detached scrutiny of a strategist reviewing battle footage. Every move had been a breach of protocol. Every decision had been driven by an instinct he was supposed to have mastered. He should have authorized a remote sedative injection, regardless of the risk. He should have maintained his distance. He should have treated the subject as a subject. He did not. He had treated Elian like a person who was his responsibility. He shut off the recording. The image of Elian, limp and vulnerable beneath his hands, was burned into his mind. The feeling of that electric jolt when he'd made contact still tingled in his palms. It was a bond. Not the sentimental, romanticized nonsense from the old texts Elian probably curated, but a raw biological reality. A circuit had been forged in the crucible of the archivist's first heat, binding them together. His alpha nature had recognized Elian's emergent Omega signature and had, without his consent, staked a claim. He brought up Elian's altered file again, the one with the hidden genetic marker. The conspiracy was a far more pressing concern than his own compromised instincts. Who had hidden Elian's true nature, and why? To what end? Hiding in Omega was a state-level crime. It suggested a player with immense power and a long-term strategy. Was Elian meant to present at a specific time, in a specific place? Was his own presence in the archive that day a coincidence, or had he been maneuvered there? The thought was chilling. For his entire life, Valerius had been the one who pulled the strings, the master of the game. The possibility that he was now a pawn, moved by an unseen hand, was intolerable. His investigation would have to be subtle, conducted outside of official channels. He could trust no one. His reputation for unassailable integrity was his greatest weapon. But this new undeniable connection to the archivist was his greatest vulnerability. He had to sever it, or at the very least, control it. He made a decision. He would see the archivist himself, not as a commander observing a subject, but as something else, an interrogator, a variable introduced into the experiment to observe the results. That was the official justification he would log. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. He needed to see him. He needed to stand in the same room with him, away from the crisis, and measure the pull, understand its strength, and learn how to fight it. When the door to the White Room hissed open, Elian flinched, expecting a medic or a guard. Instead, Commander Valerius stepped inside, alone. He wore his severe black uniform, the silver insignia on his collar catching the sterile light. The clinical distance of the observation window was gone. He was here, a solid, overwhelming presence that changed the very pressure in the room. Elian scrambled to sit up, pulling the thin sheet up to his chest, a pathetic attempt at a shield. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. The commander's scent, clean and cold, filled the small space, and Elian's body reacted instantly, a soft, involuntary tremor running through him. It was a response of submission, of recognition. He hated it. Valerius stopped a few feet from the cot, his hands clasped behind his back in a formal, rigid posture. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone, but his eyes, those piercing gray eyes, were fixed on Elian, and they were not cold. They were watchful, intense. "Archivist," he said. The use of his title, not a number, was a small, calculated courtesy. "The medical report states you are stable." It was not a question, it was a statement of fact. Elian could only nod, his throat too tight to form words. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. Elian's shame, Valerius's breach of protocol, the undeniable event that had passed between them. The air hummed with it. "I have reviewed your file," Valerius continued, his voice a low, even monotone. "Your original designation test. There are inconsistencies." Elian looked up, startled. This was not what he had expected. He had expected questions about his condition, a formal notice of his reclassification, a lecture on the trouble he had caused. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Someone altered your records," Valerius stated, his gaze unwavering. "Your Omega markers were identified and then deliberately concealed. You were never a beta." The word struck Elian with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a mistake. It was a lie. His entire life, the foundation of his identity, the source of his quiet pride, had been a deliberate fabrication. The relief on his parents' faces, had it been a lie too? Were they a part of it? The questions were a swarm of hornets in his mind. "Why?" he asked, the single word a plea. "That," Commander Valerius said, a dangerous new edge to his voice, "is what I intend to find out." In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted. He was not just a commander and a subject. They were two people at the center of a conspiracy, bound not only by biology, but by a shared, unknown enemy. The Directorate convened an emergency council. From his seat at the long obsidian table, Valerius observed the other figures of power, their faces projected as stark holograms around him. High Executor Thorn, a man whose ambition was barely concealed by a veneer of patrician civility. General Anya Petrova, her face a roadmap of old battles and political skirmishes. And the others, the faceless heads of finance, logistics, and bioengineering. They were the architects of the hegemony, the guardians of its perfect, sterile order. Today, that order had been threatened by a single, unforeseen variable. Subject 734. "A late-presenting Omega of unprecedented potency," Thorn began, his voice smooth and authoritative. "A biological asset of the highest value. Dr. Eris's report confirms that the subject's genetic profile is exceptionally robust. An opportunity of this magnitude has not presented itself in a generation." Valerius remained silent, his hands steepled before him, his expression impassive. He knew what was coming. In the cold calculus of the Directorate, an unbonded, powerful Omega was not a person. It was a resource to be allocated for maximum strategic advantage. "The subject's imprinting on Commander Valerius is a complication," Petrova noted, her holographic eyes fixing on him. "But not an insurmountable one. Bio-reconditioning protocols exist. The initial bond can be chemically severed if necessary." Valerius felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Severed. They spoke of it as if it were a simple data wipe, not a violent tearing of a fundamental connection. He thought of Elian in the White Room, the quiet dignity with which he was trying to hold himself together. The idea of subjecting him to the agony of a chemical bond severing was repulsive. "A bond with the commander is, of course, a viable option," Thorn continued, giving Valerius a politician's smile. "It would certainly secure the asset. However, the House of Valerius has long been sufficient in its contributions to the hegemony's genetic legacy. A pairing with another house, one whose loyalty could be solidified by such a union, would be far more politically expedient." The game was clear. Elian was a prize, a tool to be used in the endless power plays between the great houses that underpinned the Directorate. He would be given to the highest bidder, bonded to some brutish alpha from a family Thorn wished to indebt to him. He would be used, bred, and discarded, his life's trajectory decided in this cold, sterile meeting by people who had never even seen his face. "The Caden family has expressed significant interest," Thorn said, playing his trump card. "Lord Marius Caden is an alpha of excellent standing. A union would secure their trade sector loyalty for the next 50 years. Valerius felt a surge of cold fury, an emotion so pure and potent it nearly cracked his iron composure. Marius Caden was a notorious brute, a man who treated his consorts like property. To give Elian to him would be a fate worse than death. The primal, possessive instinct that he had been fighting roared to life, no longer a whisper, but a clear, cold imperative. "No. Mine." He kept his face a mask of neutrality. To object now, to show his hand, would be a fatal mistake. They would see it as a weakness, a sign that the imprinting had compromised his judgment. They would remove him from the equation immediately. He had to play their game, but with his own rules. "The subject's psychological state is still fragile," Valerius said, his voice calm and measured. A forced bonding at this stage could prove counterproductive. The asset could be permanently damaged. I recommend a period of stabilization and assessment before any permanent arrangements are made. It was a logical argument, one that appealed to their sense of resource management. You did not damage a valuable asset through haste. Thorne considered this. A reasonable precaution. How long? 30 days, Valerius said, under my direct supervision. I will personally oversee his preparation and ensure his stability for the chosen candidate. He was offering them exactly what they wanted, their prize, prepared and delivered by the most efficient man in the hegemony. It was a lie. He was buying time. 30 days to unravel the conspiracy of Elian's past. 30 days to formulate a plan. 30 days to prepare for the war he was about to start. Thorne nodded, satisfied. Very well. The Council agrees. Commander Valerius will oversee the conditioning of Subject 734. The formal bonding with Lord Marius Caden is scheduled for 1 month from today. The holograms flickered and died, leaving Valerius alone in the silent chamber. He had won the first skirmish, but he had also just started a countdown to a disaster. Meanwhile, in the White Room, the news was delivered by a medical officer, a woman with a flat, affectless voice. She stood in the doorway, not bothering to step inside, as if Elian were contagious. Subject 734, she said, reading from a datapad. A compatible alpha has been selected for your permanent bonding. The procedure is scheduled to take place in 30 days. You will begin a preparatory regimen of hormonal supplements and psychological conditioning immediately to ensure compliance and a successful union. Elian stared at her, the words washing over him like a tide of ice water. Permanent bonding, preparatory regimen, compliance. His future had just been erased and rewritten in the sterile language of a medical directive. He would be handed over to a stranger, an alpha not of his choosing, his body and life forfeit to the needs of the state. He thought of the commander. He thought of the flicker of connection, the shared mystery of his past. Had that all been a lie? Was Valerius simply a part of this cold, inhuman process? The hope that had taken root in the wake of their last conversation withered and died, leaving only a cold, hard despair in its place. He would not be a prize. He would not be a broodmare for some faceless, powerful alpha. He was an archivist. He was a man of quiet corners and forgotten histories. He would not let them turn him into a thing. The medical officer turned to leave, her duty done. Wait, Elian said, his voice quiet but clear. The officer paused, looking back with mild irritation. What is his name? Elian asked. The Alpha. The officer consulted her datapad. Lord Marius Caden. The name meant nothing to him, and everything. It was the name of his jailer, his owner, the name of the man who would destroy him. Elian lowered his head, his dark hair falling over his eyes. He let the officer see the despair. He let her see the broken, compliant subject. But underneath, in the silent, secret archives of his own soul, a new record was being written. It was not a record of submission. It was a record of rebellion. The 30 days began to bleed into one another, each a perfect, sterile copy of the last. Elian's world shrank to the White Room, the bland nutrient paste he was given 3 times a day, and the daily visits from the conditioning specialists. They were psychologists and biotechnicians who spoke to him in calm, soothing tones, their voices a soft poison. They showed him hollows of smiling Omega families, narrated tales of the sacred duty of the bond, and adjusted the hormonal infusions that dripped steadily into his arm. The drugs were designed to make him docile, to encourage his Omega biology to seek a bond, any bond. They smoothed the sharp edges of his panic, leaving him in a state of dull, foggy resignation. But they could not touch the core of him. In the deep quiet of his mind, the archivist was still at work. He organized his memories, cataloged his feelings, and searched for a flaw in the system that imprisoned him. He played the part they assigned him. He was pliant. He was responsive. He was the model subject, his grief and fear carefully curated into a performance of acceptance. It was the only weapon he had left. Valerius did not visit. Elian told himself he was relieved. The commander's presence was a complication, a dangerous current that pulled his treacherous biology in a direction he could not afford to go. But in the lonely hours of the artificial night, he found himself straining his ears, listening for the sound of those heavy boots in the corridor, for the scent of winter steel. The absence of the commander was a presence in itself, a hollow space that ached. He didn't know that Valerius was a constant, unseen observer. From his office, Valerius had a permanent, secure feed to the camera in Elian's room. He watched the conditioning sessions, his jaw tight with a cold, controlled rage. He saw the drugs dulling Elian's sharp intelligence, saw the forced smiles and the deadness in his eyes. Each session was a violation, an erasure of the man he had met in the archive. He was allowing it to happen, a necessary evil to maintain his cover while he worked. His own investigation was a frantic, clandestine race against time. Using backdoors and ghost algorithms he had built into the hegemony's network years ago, he delved deeper into the conspiracy. He found faint, thread-like connections between the administrator who had altered Elian's file and House Caden. It seemed Lord Marius's family had known about Elian for years. They hadn't just expressed interest. They had been waiting for him. Elian was not just a political prize. He was a custom-ordered asset, his life manipulated from childhood to deliver him into their hands. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when he cross-referenced Elian's unique genetic markers with the Caden family's biorecords. It was a 1 in a billion match. Elian's biology was uniquely, perfectly compatible with Marius Caden's. A bond between them would be unbreakable, absolute. They hadn't just wanted an Omega, they had wanted him. They had manufactured a fated pair for their own gain. The plan began to form in his mind, cold, precise, and breathtakingly dangerous. It was not a plan of rescue, it was a plan of demolition. He would not just save Elian, he would dismantle the power base of the people who had done this to him. He began to move his own pieces across the board. He reallocated security patrols, citing drills and system upgrades. He flagged Lord Caden's financial records for a quiet, anonymous audit by a rival house. He fabricated evidence of a potential security leak within the transport division that would handle Elian's transfer. He was laying a trail of breadcrumbs, creating chaos and distractions that he would later exploit. 20 days into the countdown, he knew he had to see Elian. He needed to establish a channel of communication, to plant a seed of hope, however small. He could not risk a direct conversation. The room was monitored, but he had other methods. He arrived late in the artificial night cycle, dismissing the guards on duty. He entered the white room, his movements silent. Elian was asleep or pretending to be. His breathing was even, but Valerius noted the tension in his hands, which were clenched into fists at his sides. He stood by the cot for a long moment, simply watching him. The foggy effect of the conditioning drugs was evident even in sleep. The sharp lines of Elian's face had softened into a kind of weary blankness. The sight fueled the cold fire of Valerius's resolve. He reached out, not to touch him, but to adjust the thin blanket that had slipped from his shoulder. It was a simple paternal gesture, one that would be interpreted by anyone watching as a proprietary check on a valuable asset. But as his fingers brushed the fabric, he let a small metallic object slip from his palm and fall silently onto the mattress beside Elian's hand. It was a data chip, an old obsolete model, the kind used for physical archives, the kind an archivist would recognize. It was completely blank. Its meaning was not in its data, but in its existence. It was a symbol of the world Elian had lost. It was a promise. Elian did not stir, but Valerius knew he was aware. He could feel the sudden, sharp intake of breath the man tried to suppress. Without a word, Valerius turned and left, the door hissing shut behind him, leaving the tiny, silent message in his wake. The day of the transfer arrived, gray and sterile like all the others. Elian woke with a sense of cold, final dread. In the dark, he had found the data chip. He had closed his hand around its cool, sharp edges, the feel of it a shock of reality in his drugged haze. It was a relic from his old life, a message he couldn't decipher, but which had rekindled a tiny, flickering ember of hope in the ashes of his despair. He didn't know what it meant, but it meant something. It meant the commander had not forgotten him. It meant he was not just Subject 734. He was still the archivist. Two guards, their faces impassive behind their helmets, entered his room. They carried a formal high-collared tunic of pale gray silk, the garment of a bonded Omega. The sight of it made him feel sick. "It is time," one of them said, his voice a metallic rasp. They watched, impassive, as he changed. The silk was cool against his skin, a shroud for the life he was about to lose. They led him out of the white room, down a long corridor he had never seen before. The air was different here, colder. He could smell the faint, acrid scent of engine fuel and the clean, sharp smell of ozone from the security fields. They were heading for a transport bay. Valerius watched their progress on a series of monitors in a hidden command center, a ghost hub he had built for himself deep in the station's substructure. His plan was a cascade of timed events, a house of cards built on precision and misdirection. The anonymous tip about Lord Caden's finances had already borne fruit. Caden was currently locked in a high-level inquiry with the Finance Ministry. A beautiful, unforeseen delay. The fabricated security threat had forced the transfer to be rerouted through a secondary, less secure maintenance conduit. And the security team assigned to the transfer was not the Caden family's private guard, but a hegemony unit loyal to him. Everything was in place. He tapped a command into his console. In the maintenance conduit, Elian was being led through. A series of emergency lights began to flash, and a low, wailing siren began to sound. A synthesized voice announced, "Containment breach in Sector Gamma. This is not a drill. All personnel evacuate to designated safe zones." The guards escorting Elian paused, exchanging a confused look. This was not part of their briefing. Their comms crackled with conflicting orders. It was the chaos Valerius had engineered. "Commander, we have an unscheduled containment alarm," one of the guards reported into his comm, his voice tight with tension. "What are your orders?" "The primary route is compromised," Valerius's voice came back, calm and authoritative, a rock in the sea of confusion. "Divert to emergency exit 7B. I will meet you there and take personal command of the asset's security. Proceed immediately." Exit 7B was a little-used service airlock that led to the city's underbelly, a labyrinth of steam pipes and forgotten transit tunnels. It was a place the Directorate preferred to pretend did not exist. The guards, their faith in the chain of command absolute, did not question the order. They changed course, half dragging a numb, unresisting Elian with them. They reached the airlock, a heavy circular door set into the grimy wall. It hissed open to reveal not the commander's elite guard, but the commander himself, alone. He stood in the shadows of the tunnel beyond, his formal uniform replaced by a simple dark gray fatigue jacket. He was no longer a symbol of the Directorate, he was an operator. "I'll take it from here," Valerius said, his voice low. The guards hesitated for a fraction of a second. This was a breach of protocol. A handoff was supposed to be a formal, documented procedure. But this was Commander Valerius. To question his direct order was unthinkable. The lead guard nodded, gave Elian a slight push forward, and then he and his partner turned, jogging back the way they came, eager to escape the chaos of the alarm. The airlock. Door hissed shut, leaving Elian alone in the dim, echoing tunnel with the commander. The wail of the siren was fainter here, muffled by tons of concrete and steel. The air smelled of damp metal and decay. It was the first real, organic smell Elian had experienced in a month. He stared at Valerius, his mind struggling to process the impossible situation. The alarm, the rerouting, the solitary commander in the shadows, it was too precise to be a coincidence. "Commander-y," he whispered, his voice trembling. Valerius stepped forward into a pool of faint light from a maintenance panel. His face was grim, his eyes intense. "There is no transfer, Elian," he said, using his name again, the sound of it a key turning a lock in Elian's mind. "There is no bond with Marius Caden. That life for you is over." He reached out and his fingers brushed the silver clasp of the Omega tunic at Elian's throat. His touch was brief, almost impersonal, but it sent a jolt of heat through Elian's entire body. "This," Valerius said, his voice laced with a cold contempt, "does not belong to you." Before Elian could react, a figure emerged from the deeper shadows behind Valerius. It was Valerius's second-in-command, Lieutenant Kale, a man known for his unwavering loyalty and sharp, suspicious eyes. He held a stun rifle, and it was aimed not at Elian, but at Valerius. "Commander," Kale said, his voice strained, "stand down. I received a priority alert from Directorate Security. An Omega asset, Subject 734, is being abducted. By you." Kale had not been part of the plan. He was the unforeseen variable, the loyal soldier who had seen through the deception. Valerius did not look surprised. He slowly turned to face his lieutenant, placing himself between Kale and Elian. "You were always too clever, Kyle," Valerius said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "Go back, report that you were mistaken. This does not have to end your career. My career is my loyalty to the hegemony." Kyle shot back, his knuckles white on the rifle. "Not to one man. Sir, I am ordering you to release the asset and surrender." Elian watched, his heart pounding. This was it. The moment it all fell apart. Valerius looked from his loyal, duty-bound lieutenant to the pale, terrified archivist behind him. He had known this was a possibility, that a choice would have to be made, a line crossed from which there was no return. He made the choice. "He is not an asset," Valerius said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that was pure, undiluted alpha. His eyes seemed to flash in the dim light. "He is not an experiment, and he is not yours to command." He took a deliberate step back, closing the distance to Elian, his hand finding the small of Elian's back in a gesture that was unmistakably, primally possessive. "He is mine." The declaration hung in the damp air, a statement of treason, a claim of ownership, and a promise of war. Lieutenant Kyle's face hardened. He raised the rifle. "Then you have made your choice, Commander." The standoff held for a heartbeat, a frozen tableau in the damp, echoing tunnel. Kyle, the loyal soldier, his face a mask of conflicted duty. Valerius, the rebel commander, a monolith of defiant possession. And Elian, the prize, the catalyst, standing at the epicenter of a world breaking apart. The choice was not Valerius's alone to make. In that suspended moment, Elian felt a surge of clarity so profound it burned away the last vestiges of the conditioning drugs. He was not a passive object to be claimed or rescued. He was a participant. He looked at Kale's stun rifle, then at the hard line of Valerius's back. He could submit, go with Kale, and be returned to his fate. Or he could choose the terrifying unknown that Valerius represented. He chose the storm. With a suddenness that surprised even himself, Elian lunged forward, not away from the danger, but into it. He grabbed the front of Valerius's jacket, his knuckles pressing into the commander's hard chest, and used him as an anchor to swing himself behind the larger man. It was an act of trust, of alliance, a physical declaration of his choice. The movement was all the distraction Valerius needed. As Kale's eyes flickered towards Elian, Valerius moved with a speed that was terrifyingly inhuman. He closed the distance in a single fluid motion, his hand striking the rifle, deflecting its aim. The weapon discharged with a sharp crack, sending a bolt of blue energy searing into the tunnel wall, showering the ground with sparks. Valerius didn't stop. His other hand chopped down on Kyle's wrist, forcing him to drop the weapon. A precisely aimed blow to the lieutenant's temple, and the man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Silence descended, broken only by the hiss of a severed conduit and the ragged sound of Elian's own breathing. Valerius stood over his fallen subordinate, his expression grim. There was no triumph in it, only the cold finality of a bridge burned. He bent down and retrieved Kale's comm unit, crushing it under his heel. "He will wake in 10 minutes, Valerius said, turning to Elian. His gray eyes were dark, searching Elian's face. "He will report everything. We have very little time." He stripped the gray silk tunic from Elian's shoulders with a single rough tug, leaving him in the thin undershirt. He tossed the garment aside like a piece of trash. Then he shrugged out of his own fatigue jacket and wrapped it around Elian's shoulders. It was heavy, warm, and smelled of him, of winter steel and of the cold, clean night. The scent was an anchor, a shield. "Come, Ma," he said, his voice all command again. "We have to move." He led them deeper into the labyrinth, through tunnels that grew narrower and darker. They moved quickly, Valerius navigating the maze with a familiarity that suggested he had walked these forgotten paths before. They were descending into the foundations of the city, leaving the world of sterile white corridors and polished chrome for a place of rust, decay, and memory. The ghosts of the archive felt closer here. After what felt like an hour, they emerged into a vast, cavernous space. It was an old, decommissioned transit station, silent for a century. The air was thick with the dust of ages. A single transport sled, sleek and black with no official markings, sat waiting on the rusted tracks. "My personal vehicle, Ma," Valerius explained, his voice echoing in the huge space. "Off-grid, untraceable." He guided Elian aboard. The interior was minimalist and functional, the cockpit of a predator. As Valerius initiated the launch sequence, the sled lifted with a low hum, its inertial dampeners pressing them gently back into their seats. It slid into a dark, unlit transit tube and accelerated, plunging them into absolute blackness. They were fugitives, rebels, traitors to the only world they had ever known. The silence in the cockpit was heavy. The adrenaline of the escape was fading, leaving behind a vast, terrifying uncertainty. Elian looked at the man beside him, at his profile, illuminated by the soft green glow of the controls. He had seen the commander, the interrogator, the protector, but he did not know the man. "Why?" Elian asked, the words small in the quiet hum of the sled. "Why did you do it?" Valerius kept his eyes on the navigation display, but his hands tightened on the controls. House Caden was not just acquiring an asset, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. They were correcting an old theft. My investigation suggests they have a rival, someone powerful enough to hide you from them 20 years ago. They hid you as a beta, planning to retrieve you later. For what purpose? I don't know. But when you presented, Caden moved to claim what he believed was his property. The pieces fell into place, forming a picture that was both clearer and more terrifying. Elian had been a pawn in a game so old he hadn't even been aware of it. "And you?" Elian pressed. "Why do you care?" For the first time, Valerius turned his head, his gray eyes meeting Elian's in the dim light. The cold mask of the commander was gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded. "Because their game put you in my path," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Because when I saw what they intended for you, I found their calculus unacceptable." He looked away, back at the controls, as if the admission had cost him something. "And because your biology has made a claim on mine. To allow another to take you would be a violation of my own nature. It is inefficient. Elian almost laughed at the absurdity of the last word. Inefficient. It was Valerius's way of explaining away an act of profound, world-breaking rebellion. It was his way of admitting to the bond without using the words. They traveled in silence for a long time after that, the sled a tiny, self-contained world hurtling through the forgotten veins of the planet. They were leaving the hegemony, the city, everything behind them. Elian looked at his own hands, no longer clad in archivist's gloves. He was not a beta. He was not a subject. He was not a prize. He was something new, something unwritten. He was free, and he was terrifyingly, irrevocably tied to the dangerous man beside him. The sled finally began to decelerate. A viewport dark until now slid open, revealing not the grimy tunnels of the Undercity, but a sky full of stars. More stars than Elian had ever seen in his life. Below them, a vast, dark ocean stretched to the horizon, its surface shimmering in the moonlight. Valerius was piloting them towards a small, rugged island, a dark shape against the silver water. "Where are we?" Elian breathed, the sight stealing the air from his lungs. "A place that is not on any of their maps, Valerius said. "A place to think, a place to begin." He set the sled down on a rocky cliff overlooking the sea. When he cut the engines, the silence that rushed in was not the sterile, oppressive silence of the hegemony. It was a living silence, filled with the whisper of the wind and the crash of waves against the shore. It was the sound of freedom.